This video is sponsored by Describe. In the most recent episode of Critical Role that I discussed on this channel, the evil gunslinger Ripley returned and she was accompanied by a gang of bad guys. Some riflemen, a mage, a Goliath fighter, and Kynan, an NPC who once wanted to join Vox Machina, but now returned as a sneaky, rogue-type assassin working for the bad guys. And later in the fight, Ripley summoned Orthax, a shadow demon, and I think it wound up being a really solid collection of stat blocks. It made the fight really dynamic to have such a varied group of enemies in combat. But a small part of me kind of wishes these characters could have had more personality and more identity. Aside from Ripley and Kynan and arguably Orthax, the rest of the bad guys weren't really characters. And to be clear, it absolutely worked out just fine. It was a hell of a fight, and it made for a hell of an episode. But in our own games, when we present a band of bad guys, we might not be able to count on the fight itself being quite so dramatic. And so it would actually help improve our games to spice up those villain parties a bit. And luckily for us, MCDM's book Flee Mortals has some fantastic examples of villain parties that we can drop directly into our games. And unlike Ripley and her cohorts, the members of these villain parties are specifically designed to work well together and complement each other. And they come with an evil agenda, individual identities, magic items, and some plot hooks. Basically, everything you need to help fold them into your games. And no, despite how it sounds, this video is not sponsored by MCDM, nobody's paying me to talk about this book. I just love villains, and so when I saw these villain parties in the back of this book, I knew I wanted to talk about them in their own dedicated video. And by reviewing these villain groups, hopefully we can figure out just what makes a great gang of bad guys. I am going to talk about these bad guys in some detail, in a way that you might consider to be a spoiler for some of their backstories and stuff, so if you don't want me to spoil these villains for you in case your GM wants to use them in your campaign, then send this video to your GM and make them put these villains in your game. Or you can just start running your own game, you should become a GM, it's a lot of fun, and then you can use these villains yourself, and I think you're going to have a great time. And if you're looking for more GM advice, I've got a whole bunch coming out on this channel all the time, especially right now because I'm doing nearly daily videos at the moment. Not for much longer, but I've got a bunch in the queue, they're all coming all out at once, so make sure you catch them all by subscribing and ringing the bell. Now, first of all, these are bad guys who do bad things, but the intro to this section discusses how every group of players is going to have different levels of tolerance for specific bad guy behaviors, especially some of the more real-world evils. And that's why the book recommends a Session 0, so you can get on the same page as your players. The goal isn't to remove any material that might be unpleasant. Bad guys should do unpleasant things, that's part of the deal. But that also doesn't mean that you should expose your players to their phobias or their triggers. For example, some people don't mind bad guys who are sexist or racist. Or maybe they even enjoy it because it gives them the cathartic feeling of fighting bigots and putting them in their place. I think these days that feels especially cathartic. But others have to deal with that sort of bigotry on a daily basis, and that might not be what they're looking for from their D&D games, so something like that is a lot less fun for them. And thankfully, with each villain party, the book lists off the relevant content warnings and then offers advice for how to substitute them out with other, less upsetting material that doesn't neuter the villains. For example, the Black Iron Pact doesn't need to be bigots. You can turn them into an evil cult or a secret society of traitors and still get the gist of their characters without crossing a line that might be upsetting to one or more of your players. And this is why communication with your party is so important, to make sure everyone is on the same page in advance, and you can present the best possible villains without going too far and pulling someone out of the game. Now, these villains are literally designed to complement each other in combat thanks to their shared villain actions. That's an MCDM-specific mechanic that gives bad guys specific things they can do on each round, outside of their own turn. And because these groups share a pool of villain actions, they can essentially perform combo moves and boost each other up. Also, I want to thank the people who pointed out that I misunderstood how villain actions worked the last time I talked about them. These villain actions can be used after an enemy's turn, but that means an enemy of the bad guys, not an enemy of the players. So once again, thanks to the folks who corrected me on that one. In this case, the book does offer more recommendations on the most dramatic and dynamic order to deploy these villain actions, and I think that's really smart. Not just from a game design perspective, but it also makes the book a much more useful product at the table. So when I talk about these villain actions later in this video, I'm going to specifically talk about them as if you're using the actions in the order recommended by the book, because I think that shows how they tend to build off each other in interesting ways, which will hopefully help guide the battle so the tension rises and falls in a sufficiently dramatic fashion. These villain groups also all come in a party of 5, which is awfully convenient, and that is the kind of thing that would make me reluctant to include more than 1 or 2 groups in a full campaign, because I'd be worried that the groups would all start to feel the same. A lot of them also have similar lineups as well. There's usually a big strong guy, a sneaky mysterious person, one of them is usually the sadist in the group. They lean on archetypes, and that's not at all a bad thing, but these tropes will become a lot more noticeable the more groups you throw at your party. However, another way to resolve this is, rather than limiting the number of groups that appear in the campaign, instead just make sure each group has a lot of foreshadowing, and that they're integrated into the story in unique ways. For example, you could introduce 1 or 2 villains at a time. The book just recommends that if you're going to introduce a solo villain, then basically give them the full Ripley treatment. Give them a few henchmen, a cool magic item, and some ways to escape, or to get resurrected after the fight. But the goal here is to introduce some villains as solo threats, as the bad guys of their own quest or mini-arc, and to make that a satisfying story for the players.
Otto Octavius was weak. Call me Dr. Octopus!
Or maybe you do foreshadow that each of these bad guys is working for the same organization, or serving some unseen big bad.
I do admire your spunk, son. Not enough to let you go, of course. That'd be bad for business.
Whose business?
Can't tell you the who.
Then tell me the why.
And then you can eventually unite them as a villain team-up group and capture some fun drama, where the heroes realize all these bad guys have come together for one big fight.
Ah, you two are partners again?
Us two? Afraid you ain't getting off that easy, bug.
Now then, Arachnid, any last words?
Humana comes to mind.
Additionally, you don't have to introduce each villain individually to build the tension. You can use other techniques to foreshadow them and integrate them into the story. For example, the book offers a potential order of events for you to slowly introduce these villains to your heroes. First, the party learns about the evil things the bad guys have done, maybe by discovering the aftermath of some horrible thing they did.
Spider-Man's back in black and on a crime spree!
What?
Second, the party could fight with some lackeys of the bad guys, or, like we discussed a moment ago, they could fight one or two members of the villain party on their own.
The big man did this to me, to get to you.
Big man? Who's the big man?
That's need to know only.
Then, the villain party can strike back, and this can be the real final fight, or just the first shot across the bow. Maybe they do something like burn down the party's base of operations, or kidnap an NPC, or steal something or destroy something important to the party, and they make it obvious that it was them, because that's the point. They're trying to terrorize the heroes.
Bring me Peter Parker!
And then by that point, the heroes should want to confront the villains, and then you can get your epic confrontation.
I just took down the Rhino. A pale guy in a suit doesn't
Don't move. Just listen, and I'll teach you the facts of life.
Of course, this book doesn't provide everything you might need. You're still going to need maps, descriptions, dialogue, maybe some evil theme music, but thankfully you can get your hands on all of that by signing up for today's sponsor, Describe. Describe is an incredible resource for game masters where a team of any award-winning writers produce fantastic material that you can drop directly into your games. You want narration you can read aloud to describe monsters and villains? They've got it. You want dynamic maps that can change from day to night or change seasons and have narrations built into them so you can read the descriptions for specific landmarks on the map? They've got it. You want dynamic music that you can use to enhance your game? They've got it. And you want to save some money on a membership? Well, I can help with that. If you visit describe.com/supergeek and use the promo code supergeek at checkout, you can save 10% off of your first subscription payment. Once again, that's dscryb.com/supergeek and use the promo code supergeek. Thanks so much to Describe for sponsoring this video. So now let's take a look at these specific villain parties, because I think they're a ton of fun, and they can inspire you to come up with some really fun adventures and campaigns. First of all, we got the Grave Order, appropriate for a 3rd level party. Content warnings are enslaved spirits, body horror, and religious desecration, although I'll also add one more that the book doesn't include, and that's fungal infection in humans. I don't mean athlete's foot, I mean more like cordyceps, which I mentioned specifically because cordyceps infections really freak me out, and since one of the members of the Grave Order uses fungus to infect zombies, I definitely want my GM to talk to me about that one. But overall, I love the Grave Order because I love undead, and they're a really fun group of bad guys for a low-level party to face. The members of the Grave Order are either necromancers or reanimated former corpses. They specifically want to turn dead heroes into corporeal or incorporeal undead servants. And I especially love this because it's a great way to give your players an excuse to explore the history of your campaign setting. Do you want to figure out which tombs the Grave Order are planning to desecrate? Well, then you need to interface with the lore of the campaign setting and learn about the battles that were fought here a few hundred years ago, and find out where those legends were laid to rest. I also like that these bad guys all represent different types of undead-themed villains. Lestheris Soldry wants to become a lich. Jedar Pike serves Vodor, the forgotten god of death, who could easily be swapped out for Vecna if that's more your speed. Myket is a tiefling infected with fungus and using fungus to create zombies. Halloran Yandris is a sadist who is also undead, and I don't know, I always like undead bad guys who are just evil for the love of it. It reminds me of the villains like Strahd or Barbossa or the Ghoul from the Fallout TV show, especially in the early episodes.
In my life, I've been called many names. My favorite is Tombstone.
And there's also the Horror, which is a Frankenstein monster compiled from the corpses of multiple members of another adventuring party, the Golden Valor. And in fact, I would probably integrate the Grave Order into the Sunless Citadel adventure. In that adventure, you're looking for some members of an adventuring party, but there's no details about that party. Well, you could just use the Golden Valor, and then that gives you an excuse to discover the horror and begin to learn about the Grave Order. And in fact, the horror can be that solo monster, because if you take it down in combat, well, it's already a Frankenstein monster, so it's pretty easy for the Grave Order to come back and revive the horror. The Grave Order also has some really cool villain actions that mostly involve bringing minions into the fight. Their order of their villain actions goes as follows: animate skeletons, command their undead minions to attack, then the horror charges and makes a whirlwind attack, then the fungal zombies explode, and finally they animate some shades to fight the heroes. And MCDM's minions are always a fun mechanic that really help adventurers feel badass as they wade through monsters that have only 1 hit point each, and undead lend themselves especially well to that fantasy, so this all works really well for me. Next up we have the Abominations, ideal for a 5th level party. Content warnings include body horror, torture, cannibalism, and a backstory that includes themes of eugenics, because the Abominations are monsters made out of different animals stitched together, and their goal is just to eat people. That's it. Nothing fancy, no master plan. They just want to eat people.
Sorry, pal, no eating in the subway.
Obviously, any one of these can be a solo monster and be really scary, but they also work really well as a group. Boog is a lot like the Hulk, saying things like Boog Smash. Kemal is the group's shaman and also their butcher who prepares their meals, and probably the most interesting member of the party, at least to me. XS is a sneaky solo hunter who lends themselves to the best to a solo adventure. You can just do Predator or Alien, and XS would be the perfect bad guy for that. Clar is the leader of the hunt, but he's also getting curious about religion and starting to wonder if their group has a divine purpose, so you could get some really interesting role-playing scenes with Clar. And Sayer torments victims from the sky, they're the sadist, and they also have some psionic powers as well. They've also got a nice spread of villain actions in this group. First, Sayer flies an enemy across the field, you've got some movement there. Then on round 2, XS hypnotizes someone, just like Ka from the Jungle Book, and I just really like that. On round 3, Seamal throws out scraps of meat and other members eat them and get some hit points back, which is a really smart villain action to include in the 3rd round, and it fits them really well thematically. Next, Clar rushes someone and attacks, and all the other members also rush toward Clar, because Clar is the leader, and that's a really cool way to represent that. And finally, Boog stomps the ground and knocks everybody prone. That's a nice varied array of abilities that all work really well with each other and all keep the fight really dynamic. Next up, ready to take on a 7th level party, we have the Black Iron Pact. Content warnings are racism and sexism, because the Black Iron Pact are human separatists. Now, these guys actually first appeared in Matt Colville's live-streamed campaign, The Chain, and were essentially the template used for all these other villain parties. And their goal is to conquer the city of Capital, tear down the influence of other cultures, and institute a pro-Ajax theocracy. So they're essentially meant to be the bad guys for an urban campaign. But they're also specifically looking for Ringwell, which is a huge dungeon underneath Capital. And they would actually be fantastic bad guys for any Mega Dungeon campaign, because they're just looking for magic items and treasure they can use to gain more power, and so they can keep going into the Mega Dungeon, which is the perfect way for them to come into conflict with the heroes. Sure, your heroes and the members of the Black Iron Pact might square off against each other and posture in the streets of the city, but once they're down in the bowels of Ringwell or Undermountain or whatever dungeon makes the most sense for your campaign, that's where they can really be let off the chain and go to town against the heroes.
I don't think I can fit, and I don't do good in tunnels.
Keep the police busy. We'll handle the wet work.
Now, I know some people don't think discussions of real-world politics belong in videos about D&D. If that's how you feel, then just plug your ears for a minute. Because the villains in the Black Iron Pact are not subtle. They are absolutely inspired by real-world politics, and whether deliberately or not, some of these political concepts have played a role in modern US politics. And the reason that's actually a good thing is because we can use these real-world politics as a template to figure out how the Black Iron Pact operates in the politics of the city, because we can see how people do the same thing in our own world, and just rip that off for our campaign. Lord Erasmus Decio is a bigot who thinks his beliefs are the majority opinion, because he doesn't understand everyone around him just puts up with him because he's wealthy and powerful. And God, I feel like I see someone like that at least 3 times a day on Twitter, including the guy who bought Twitter, actually, come to think of it. Canon Athenodorus is religious, but he also privately converts people to worship Ajax. And gee, I can't imagine what it would be like for people to openly worship a popular religion, but then actually use it as a vehicle to essentially idolize someone they agree with politically, despite that person representing the exact opposite of what their faith guides them to believe in. What fun escapist fantasy this is. Lady Zavala Decio is a wizard who agrees with her husband's sexism, and doesn't think women should have a role in politics, despite the fact that she personally would be disenfranchised if they get what they want. So, she's a trad wife. And then the final 2 members aren't nearly as obviously political, but they're still great villains. Quar, Master of Jackals, is a xenophobic monk and a pirate captain, which is badass. And he likes to kill unconscious enemies, and thanks to his superior monk speed, he's great at running up on those fallen foes and beating them to death. That's super cool and super evil, but you've got to make sure to foreshadow that before deploying it against your players. This should be exactly the kind of thing they should be able to find out about before they even cross blades with the Black Iron Pact. Maybe by finding bodies and rolling medicine checks, or even asking the corpses how they died with the Speak with Dead spell. And the final member of the Black Iron Pact is Cloak, a mysterious assassin who wears a mask. And the book doesn't give you any clues about their identity. Instead, they just say that you should decide who's secretly behind that mask. And I like that they basically encourage you to make them the most dramatic option possible, like a beloved NPC the heroes trust. And sure, I could talk about the way that finding out someone you love is secretly a member of an extremist political cult does mirror real-world politics these days, and that's kind of what happened to my grandparents in the final years of their life. Or I could play another semi-relevant clip from the Spectacular Spider-Man, which I think we'd all prefer.
We know who you love the most, bro. Ready?
The Black Iron Pact's villain actions are mostly similar to what we've already seen, which makes sense, considering the first draft of the Black Iron Pact was the first villain party design, before this book ever came about. But also, now that we're getting into higher levels, some of these villain actions involve magic spells, which is really cool. Quar moves fast and allows his nearby allies to do the same. Athenodorius hexes nearby foes with necrotic damage and blindness. Avala casts a less powerful version of Chain Lightning. Cloak moves and strikes with some awesome sneak attack adjacent damage. And Erasmus is able to command an ally to use another villain action again, which is so good. That's a fantastic final villain action. It makes perfect sense for the leader of this party, and it's a really great for a mid-level challenge. I really like it. Next up, coming in at 9th level, we've got the Wilderkith. Content warnings include terrorism and eco-terrorism, which you can solve by not having them kill indiscriminately. They can just let innocent people live if those topics upset you. The Wilderkith are essentially representatives of the wilderness, and they want to destroy civilization. They burn down villages and towns and destroy roads, dams, and farms to try to return the world to nature.
Behold! I am Mysterio, here to save the world from the evils of technology corrupting the human spirit.
Are we being punked? I hate that.
The Wilderkith are led by Anthracia, Princess of Venom, a vengeful dryad who escaped prison in the Gem Hollow and left Arcadia with some like-minded followers. Other members include Logger, who's basically just evil Groot, Sylvies, a forest nymph, Tuval Uthriar, an elf and a former paladin, who's actually reluctant to harm elves who cross their path. That's a really cool dynamic. There's potential for these characters to turn against each other. And finally we have Vali, an awesome elven hunter who lives in exile.
Sergei Kravinov needs no tranquilizers to bring down his prey.
We'd better hope you're right.
Well, Vali has actually taken a vow of silence, so it wouldn't go quite like that, but you get the idea. Now, I haven't been discussing the magic items that each party carries, but they've all got 2 unique magic items. But I really want to bring attention to Waning Moon, which is Vali's magic bow. When you fire the bow, you can actually turn invisible, which is such a great power for an elven bow. It lines up with things like the elven cloaks from Lord of the Rings. But also, honestly, we just need more magical bows in D&D. In 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, aside from the generic +1, +2, +3 weapons, the only magical bow is the Oath Bow, which is a very rare magic item. So getting more cool magical bows is always a good thing. Balls in your court, 2024 DMG. Now, the villain actions here aren't anything terribly distinct from what we've seen so far. Anthracia can move the heroes around, which is a really cool power for the first round of combat, and Logger can wrap enemies up in vines, so we've got 2 abilities that can move or restrict the heroes. But then Sylvies rushes someone and attacks them, which makes sense. It's usually the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th villain action, because it's intense, but it's also not a complete game changer, and the party can still react to it before the really nasty stuff comes later on. In the 4th round, Tuval Uthriar causes his nearby allies to each get a free attack, which is pretty nasty, but hopefully some of the bad guys are dead by the 4th round. And finally, Vali attacks and allows his allies to move and hide, and I especially like that one. It really helps capture the guerrilla-style tactics of the Wilderkith. Next up, we get the Amethyst Knife, built to challenge a level 11 party. No content warnings here, they're just your classic former adventurers who got psychic powers and decided to build a criminal syndicate. Once again, these guys are perfect for an urban campaign, like something along the lines of Waterdeep Dragon Heist, but much higher level. They're trying to gain control over the criminal underworld, but they're also trying to stay off the radar. As the book says, the group uses subterfuge and pawns to avoid the ire of law enforcement and so-called heroes.
You frighten criminals off the street entirely, except when you're off battling the likes of the Rhino. Then the big man's profitable army of petty thugs think themselves beneath the Spider-Man's notice.
The faction is led by Harlow Honeygrin, a spiteful and vain criminal halfling. He also made a deal with a fae, Barisquith, who appears as a swashbuckling mouse with an eye patch, because this is just the best book ever made. We've also got Jutkar Flintfingers, a dwarven old man and a problem solver who looks down on thieves. He kind of sounds like the wolf from Pulp Fiction or Mike from Breaking Bad. We've also got Livessa, she who leaps across moonlight, our enigmatic elven archer. Trayvon von Hirschman is the powerful half-elf son of a duke who craves power and maybe just a hint of vengeance. And the last is Vic Graves, a former street tough who is now Harlow's bodyguard. She wields a magical psychic rapier and she just looks fly as hell. In fact, I think this group would be fantastic to bump into individual members throughout an urban campaign, especially because they're often untouchable, since it doesn't seem like they've actually broken any laws, and that'll be a really fun dynamic to explore throughout the campaign.
Officers, Spider-Man has trespassed on my property, assaulted my employees, and threatened my person.
Again, as far as villain actions go, Trayvon moves allies around, Livessa shoots a psychic arrow that goes through targets like a lightning bolt spell, Jutkar can swap the bosses of the Amethyst Knife around, Vic can taunt a foe, and that has a whole bunch of extra psychic side effects, and Harlow can fire a psychic blast against an enemy. So we've got 2 that control the movement of the members of the Amethyst Knife, and 3 that just make a psychic attack. I don't know that I'd say this feels like the most dramatic list or the most dynamic list, but they do build on each other in interesting ways. For example, Livessa's arrow shot is good, but it's so much better when you remember that Trayvon just moved a bunch of his allies around, so he could better move Livessa into a potential position to shoot through a bunch of targets. Jutkar can swap the positions of these 5 bad guys, so he can move Vic toward the foe that makes the most sense to taunt and screw with. So these aren't the flashiest powers, but they should work really well together. In a way, that's kind of the perfect metaphor for these villains as well. They're not flashy, they're not in your face, but that's why they're effective. Next up, coming in to challenge your level 13 heroes are the Soulbinders. Content warning here is possession, because these bad guys are actually just possessed by their cursed weapons, which feed on their life force.
No.
These mortals wanted to become immortal, but they wound up imprisoned in their magic items. So now they want to be free and become gods. In order to accomplish that task, they want to be worshipped as gods now. And much like with the Grave Order, these characters really run the gamut. Each one feels like a different take on the kind of person who would try to become immortal. Argon Rael is trapped in a pair of bracers, but he's a tiefling who just sought magical secrets and also likes to subjugate people and watch them suffer. Kenisha Darrowwind is a half-elf monk who fought against an elf warlord, but has now become a wannabe warlord, and she lacks any self-awareness about that. She's bound to a pair of boots. Prince Elon Farah craves the throne that he was denied, and he's appropriately trapped in a crown, which is frankly a far too perfect a metaphor. Scarlet Shadow is an enigmatic dragonborn and the group's resident sadist. He's an assassin, and he longs to become the god of death. He's currently bound to a ring, which is very appropriate, very Sauron of him. And Radley the Grim Thurgram is actually a soldier who was sent to fight Prince Elon. But then her unit died, she killed her commander, became a sellsword, partnered with the Scarlet Shadow, got hired by Prince Elon, so she's just a hired thug, essentially. She's currently trapped in a cloak. Obviously, I don't need to tell you that a big chunk of their entry is about their magic items, and about how the rules for the possession actually works. Because it's designed to be a slow burn, enough that the players will know that something is happening, but not know why. Possession is always really tricky in D&D, but I feel like MCDM has earned the benefit of the doubt here. I trust that these rules will at least try to resolve a lot of the issues that I typically have with possession in D&D. So I'd be down to give these a try in my own game. And already we have a really organic way for this faction to be introduced long before you actually deal with them in combat. After all, imagine the Craven Edge storyline from Vox Machina plays out. Grog has a cursed sword that's slowly overtaking his will, they get rid of the sword, all is well. But then imagine Craven Edge returned, and now he's just a dude, and he's got 4 other friends with him, and they're also all controlling the bodies of people who found some cursed items. And now you've got this dramatic moment where you could see just how bad things could have gone for the cursed player character. And that's assuming the storyline ended the way that the Craven Edge story did, where they successfully ended the curse. There's also a potential outcome where that player character did get overwhelmed by the power of his cursed magic item, and the player lost a PC because of it, because they literally transformed into a villain.
Mark, stop! Let us help you! You don't have to do this.
I'm sorry, but I do.
And then one day that character returns with a bunch of new cursed allies, and you get this cathartic conclusion to that curse storyline long after the fact. It's really cool. There's a lot of great potential here for fantastic drama. And the Soulbinders have some really solid villain actions too. Elon can let out a battle cry to mess with the heads of the heroes. Radley can move and hide and allow some nearby allies to do the same, which is going to really change the fight in the second round. Kinsha unloads a flurry of attacks at all of her nearby enemies. Argon explodes negative energy around him, dealing force damage and potentially reducing your speed to 0. And the Scarlet Shadow teleports and attacks, and any hit is a crit. And that would be especially powerful if, as recommended, it was deployed in the 5th round, where a crit could potentially drop a player character. And finally, coming in at level 15, we've got the Hallowed Dark. Content warnings include terrorism, torture, and blood, because these guys are our big, nasty apocalypse cult. Their goal is to prepare the world for the return of Kazaldrath, the Sun Eater, and usher in the end of the world.
I summon the dark forces. Show us your master plan for this sullied world.
And these villains are just excellent examples of doomsday cultists. Aranar and Athmia Valkis are twins born under an eclipse, and they've got weird powers. Aranar has divine magic without a divine source, and Athmia can conjure psychic blades. Kathis is a tiefling raised in secret before he was discovered and run out of town, so we can imagine why he might be a bit antisocial. Draven Malus is a sorcerer who boils the blood of his enemies, and Vivian Duros is a noblewoman who wants to kill the gods. All of them have had visions of Kazeldrath devouring the sun, and they visited a temple and got some sort of draconic gift from him. So now they're running around performing profane rituals and doing terrorism, trying to spread fear, because that's also part of it. And as far as their villain actions go, we've got a few really cool ones. Aranar can move some allies around, but in this case, they actually teleport in position rather than just getting bonus movement, which is an upgrade from some of the lower level abilities. Athmia moves and attacks. Kaithus takes a special arrow shot, and if it drops the target to 0 hit points, they die. That's a nasty ability, but round 3 feels like a reasonable time where using it might drop a PC, but it's not guaranteed. Fourth, Draven drains life force from an enemy, and that's potent because it doesn't just harm a hero, but also heals one of the bad guys. But then as the big showstopper, Vivian throws her axe like it's Thor's hammer, and then it comes back to her, so she essentially attacks everyone in a radius around her. And man, that just kicks all kinds of ass. I love it. Look, I love bad guys, but I'm not really super mechanically minded when it comes to D&D. I can appreciate some good mechanics when I see them, but it's really hard for me to generate these kind of complementary mechanics like we get with the villain actions. But honestly, I don't even think that's the coolest selling point of these villain groups, because I think these are just a bunch of collections of really solid characters that your players will just love to hate. Now, I love a good misunderstood or sympathetic bad guy from time to time. Sometimes it can be more satisfying for the bad guy to have a point, because that can put the heroes in a position where they have to try to choose the lesser evil, and that can lead to some really wonderful drama. But unless that's the central theme of your campaign, then it doesn't need to be the default. And even if it is the central theme, sometimes you do just want truly evil bad guys to serve as a palate cleanser. And that's something that I think these villain parties do really well. They're all just straight up evil. Now, a lot of these groups do have some diversity of motivations within the members, so you might find that some individual villains have the potential to be more sympathetic than others. And as a GM, you're empowered to decide how sympathetic you want these causes to be when you play these villains at the table. I'm thinking especially about Anthracia, the leader of the Wilderkith. Depending on your interpretation, she could either be an enormously sympathetic victim just trying to protect her homeland, or she could be a mustache-twirling psychopath. And even for the bad guys who don't necessarily have such obviously nuanced motivations, you can still dive into the depths of psychological trauma to find ways to make these villains sympathetic in some way.
Experiment will commence in 5 seconds. 4, 3,
No, this is not right!
2,
No, not
1,
right!
0.
I've been good!
But also, some of these characters are just really good bad guys. And sometimes it's a lot of fun to play someone who is just unrepentantly evil. It's really freeing to just play a bunch of nasty little stinkers.
Look, Doc, you thought this through? The next Spider-Man who finds you under a pile of debris might view this as a cautionary tale.
Glib does not equate with clever, Spider-Man!
Yeah, well, the ratio of arms to sanity hasn't exactly been established either.
Also, if there's only one lesson you take away from this video, let it be this one. If you haven't picked up a copy of Flea Mortals, go check it out. And if there's 2 lessons, then the second one is, if you haven't seen The Spectacular Spider-Man, you should go watch it. It's great. Josh Keaton is the definitive Peter Parker performance in my mind, and the show itself is a nearly perfect adaptation that I'll definitely talk about again before too long. It's not streaming anywhere for free right now, but it's absolutely worth dropping some money and watching it on Amazon Prime or whatever. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you liked this video. It was a lot of fun to make. And I hope you enjoyed the clips. Actually, I know you enjoyed the clips. So really I hope the clips made it through the copyright process. I'm really rolling the dice there. If you want to support this channel, please make sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell. When I put out bonus videos, there's a decent chance that a lot of my audience misses them because they're not subscribed and they're not getting notified about videos released on non-standard days. And so it's not until they come back around that they find out that they missed a bunch of videos. So if you don't want that to happen to you, subscribe and ring the bell. You can also help support the channel financially by joining my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. That honestly helps out a whole lot more than I can say. You can hang out with other awesome people by signing up for my Discord server, and you can catch my latest news and updates by signing up for my newsletter. It's election season in the USA, and so if you're eligible to vote, make sure to do so. Make a voting plan and go get to it. And at the end of this video about creating truly evil characters, I was going to point out that Trump's family was found guilty of stealing money from one of their own charities, because surely that's the most cartoonishly evil thing he could be, right? And then his former chief of staff, John Kelly, shared accounts of how Trump's White House offered to pay for an Army private's funeral, an Army private who was murdered by a fellow soldier on an Army base, by the way, and Trump offered to pay until they got the bill, at which point he said, quote, "It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury a fucking Mexican, don't pay it." And later in the day, he was still upset, so he said, "Can you believe it? Fucking people trying to rip me off." And apparently on another occasion, he said, "I need the kind of generals that Hitler had," because he likes that Hitler's generals didn't question their orders, because Surely, that's the most pressing issue with the United States military. They don't blindly follow orders often enough. That's where our armed forces and our military-industrial complex needs the most reform. And when John Kelly, Trump's chief of staff and a former general, pointed out that a bunch of Hitler's generals tried to assassinate him, Trump denied that, insisting, no, Hitler's generals were very loyal. And Trump also said that Hitler did some good things. And sorry, just to be clear, when I say Hitler, I'm talking about Adolf Hitler. The one from World War II. The bad one. Like, none of this is new information. He's already said lots of racist stuff about Mexicans, he's disparaged the military, he's publicly praised modern dictators, and he's done all of that in front of microphones that he knew were on, so it's not really surprising to hear these quotes from John Kelly, but it's still bad. I think liking things that Hitler did is bad. I think most people generally agree that the only good thing Hitler did was kill Hitler. And remember, we're talking about Adolf Hitler. Yeah, it's the same one you're thinking of. Anyway, just some food for thought before you head into the voting booth. Jesus, can I get another palate cleanser with a literal cartoon villain who is somehow less cartoonishly evil?
Oh, will you please just shut up?
That's Spidey. He can whip it out. But he can't take it.
That's better. Nothing like some mild body horror to help take your mind off the crushing existential dread of a fascist being within the stone's throw of the presidency again. It can honestly be hard to imagine a fictional villain who is as openly vile as the real Donald Trump. But if you're having a hard time imagining any aspect of your fictional story, perfect segue, check out my recent bonus video about the difference between writer's block and burnout. That's a great video that a lot of you didn't check out, and I think you're missing out. It's a really good one. Until next time, play fair, and have fun. And vote. Please vote.